Mike, we were talking backstage, having been talking for the past few minutes, we were talking backstage about how does this conversation fit into the day's event. We've got this nice crowd, ladies and gentlemen gathered to hear about prosecutorial discretion and bail reform and algorithmic justice and all the things, and we're going to talk about graffiti for a moment. But this conversation is, I think, very relevant, and particularly so given the particular nature of the work that you do. You are a graffiti artist, and your work, therefore, exists, that form, your art form, exists in many places in a gray area of the law. And that can have consequences. Let's start with Project B. So you've had this tremendous arc, this tremendous career. You began with Project B, taking an abandoned, just looking at the possibility, bringing out the possibility in an abandoned project in New Orleans. And most recently, your now 35,000 square foot studio, Studio B, has been featured on Queen Sugar, Ava DuVernay's show. You have thrown a party with thousands of people featuring the likes of Erykah Badu on stage. Tell us about Project B. Yeah. Let's start there.
I mean, I think art is a form of communication, and New Orleans was faced with a very big crisis. You know, Hurricane Katrina did a lot of things that was one part nature, one part political, and space became a huge political conversation. So spaces that were forgotten in the context of a city moving forward, I found that walls became the best way to have a conversation around those forgotten spaces. And I wasn't the first to do it, but there were other artists and people who were using walls to communicate, and I felt, you know, I wanted to add my voice to that song, if you will. And that particular space, I started painting in, not knowing people would pay attention nationally or even outside of the neighborhood that I painted in, but it started something that ended up consuming my life.
Yeah. So it's just, this was an abandoned housing complex. Mm-hmm. And you didn't like ask anyone's permission. You just...
No, you don't ask permission. I mean, it was one of those things where we felt, myself as well as the other artists I met in the process, we felt if anybody was super concerned about what we were doing, their priorities were mixed up, because here was a space, like I said, it was 8 years post-Katrina, completely abandoned and forgotten to those who saw it from a distance. But to the people who live next door, the people who walk by it every day, it was a constant reminder of neglect. And if anything, if that space was sick, we felt art had a responsibility of sorts to heal it, or art had a role to play in changing the narrative, or at least amplifying the voices of those who were nearby.
Yeah, and there was a moment because of the property manager at that complex. He came by and he saw you, and he saw the work that you were doing. And what happened next?
There was a crossroads where it could have went a few ways. It could have been, I see what you're doing, I'm fearful and I'm calling the authorities, or I'm curious about what you're doing. And we saw the curiosity, so we saw the curiosity as an opportunity. One of my favorite quotes says, when you see boundaries as opportunities, the world becomes a limitless place. And so that boundary became an opportunity, and out of that opportunity grew what became known as Exhibit B, which was we asked for permission to take a part of that space and to invite artists to come in and transform this neighborhood or this unit of apartments. And it was over 35 artists. It took us about 15 days, and we transformed it and invited the public, and it just kind of... That could have went a lot of ways, too.
Also could have went a lot of ways, yeah. I think that that's a really powerful place to begin this conversation in light of what you all have been, what we've been talking about here on stage all day. That crossroads of possibility, one direction going into a place that I don't think any of us want, and one direction going into this place of just transcendent beauty. Let's take that moment to actually look at some of the work that you've done to see this art. So I don't know if you can see this image, B-Mike. Talk about this, where this is in New Orleans.
So this is on the backside of Studio B, my warehouse in New Orleans, 35,000 square feet. It's like the end of the story, I guess, if you will, in terms of after painting in public spaces in New Orleans for a series of years, finding myself in this interior space where I was given access to just make it my first solo show. So in this 35,000 square foot warehouse is all my artwork. And on the outside of this building is this, there's a few paintings, but this is the newest one I just completed a couple weeks ago. And it's just a dedication to the creative spirit of New Orleans, but also the possibility of that neighborhood, the possibility of, I like to think that in my art, I hope people could see themselves reflected. And in this idea of growth, there's a quote on the wall by Clint Smith, a friend of mine who's a poet, and it says, "Your joy has inscribed itself on the sidewalk and has never been washed away." So these are opportunities to articulate and to just have this, a love story, it's like a poem, every painting I can do, and that's what that embodies.
You said that one of your mentors had been talking to you about truth, integrity. You said to Ebony Magazine, you said, "My elders taught me art for art's sake is not true. Artists will always, as Paul Robeson said, be the gatekeepers of truth."
Yeah.
And that conversation happened in the context of the use of halos. One of the things that you have been working around in your art has been the use of halos and images like this. Talk about your evolution on how you've used halos around figures of the civil rights movement.
I mean, I think it's fitting that we're in the portrait gallery, and it's a conversation around what portraits are allowed to do. I think portraits traditionally have been reserved in a lot of ways for those who society deemed important enough to be painted. And I think a lot of work that I do around portraits, especially being blessed to do portraits on large scales that interrupt people's visual pathway. You know, people don't ask to see this, or for the most part, if they drive in the street, they're going to see this. And I think there's an opportunity there to assign value to narratives that can be overlooked. And so being that I paint portraits oftentimes of people of color, oftentimes of children, it's an opportunity to say that there's value here. And I think for me in the beginning, doing halos was a way it was like a crutch of sorts to say, okay, I'm going to force you to see the value by seeing this halo that we traditionally reserved for deities or for things that are religious based. So the halo was kind of like a way to instantly confirm or solidify that this person is valuable. I think though, however, that I kind of been transitioning out of the use of halos in a way to show that just the sake of being human is enough to show value. That we exist and we breathe, and that's enough to make that kid valuable. And so, but I think that's what paintings is at its best can do. The idea of art for art's sake, I think, is a privilege, you know, to say that I can just create from what's in my head, and that alone is what I will do. I think what Paul Robeson, at least the way I interpreted his idea of artists being the gatekeepers of truth, there's a responsibility there that says, okay, if you're on this stage, if you have this platform, there's a responsibility that truth has to be spoken. And I think it was Dr. Cornel West that said a condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. He said you can't speak truth unless somehow in your words embodies the pains and bruises of everyday people. And so for me, that's the responsibility of an artist, to say, okay, with my paintbrush, with my can, I'm going to speak truth. That's what we did in that abandoned space. We didn't just say, okay, let's paint rainbows and pretty things. Yeah. We had to be truthful. We had to say, okay, what exists here is a story that people overlooked, and let's talk about that. Let's talk about why. Let's talk about displacement. Let's talk about how people who were forced out of New Orleans couldn't return. Let's talk about the conditions that created a space like this. And I think that's why people resonated with the work so well.
Yeah. I'm going to move to the next image. Where is this in the city, and why the Sistine Chapel?
So this is in New Orleans East, and there's an area of New Orleans. We were having conversations around peace and around violence reduction. And the goal was to, at that time, New Orleans East was one of the most violent areas of the city. And I worked with some community members and community organizations that were working towards curbing the violence. And here was the opportunity to amplify a message about peace, but also to encourage those who were doing the work. So all in this paintings are individuals who are doing the work in that neighborhood. And it was a gift to them in a way, to show them that, you know, their work is appreciated, their efforts are not overlooked. But then there's a reminder in the corner, and it says, "We have work to do." And this it's an abandoned movie theater in New Orleans, and it sits off of an interstate, one of the main interstates in the city. So everyone has to see this. And so it's a reminder that there's work to be done, but it's also a celebration of those doing the work. And the Sistine Chapel aspect of it is just a way, at the time, there was criticisms around my use of spray paint and how that isn't art. And this somebody, I think the comment, you always think about the negative comments, but somebody
don't read the comments.
Somebody posted, "Oh, this is just glorified graffiti." And so here was a way to show, okay, you know, Sistine Chapel was not on canvas. That was like street art or a mural, or, you know, so it was a way to kind of reconnect it back to what people might consider to be art. So yeah.
We're going to show one last image, and this is also a reference to a series of iconic images that touch on activism. The flower and the bayonet. This evokes a lot of images going back to the Vietnam War and probably before. And most recently, there was that image of Aisha Evans facing down in nothing more than a dress, a set of cops in body armor. Talk about this image and what led you to create it.
Inside Studio B, and it's one of the walls that existed. I built some walls in the space, but this wall existed when I got there. And it was an attempt to have this updated conversation around policing, as well as around the superpower that I find that these giants in history that I celebrate, that they all had. And next to this wall is a portrait of Dr. King, there's a portrait of Coretta, Fannie Lou Hamer, Paul Robeson. And when we do tours here with kids, we tell them, you know, when do you give people flowers? And they all say, oh, when you love somebody, when you like somebody. All in the gun it says fear, and all in her hair it says love. This was inspired by two quotes, one by the poet Saul Williams, and he said, "I'm not afraid of you, I'm just a victim of your fear." And when you think about that, you kind of get an understanding of policing. You'll see some of the things that we've seen around policing. And then there's another quote that was inspired by the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, and he said, "How do you look terror in the face and still muster the courage to love?" And to me, that's the superpower. Like, how do you look at terror and say, you know what, my response to this will be love? And I always tell the kids, you know, that's what, at its best, is depicted through the histories that we celebrate. This history of love that says, you know what, if you don't like me, I'm not going to respond by not liking you more.
Yeah.
But somehow I'm going to find the courage to love. And that's what that piece is about.
Your work exists in, your art form exists in this continuum. On one end, you said, you know, art for art's sake is not true. On one end of graffiti art, you've got taggers. And these are folks who are just spraying their tag on every surface that they can reach in a city, just to say, I'm here, I exist, and I reach this place, right? And then on the other end, you've got this. You've got these murals, these incredible, these gigantic works of creation. I'm curious, talking about art being true. Part of what you did with Project B, part of what you do at Studio B, is you try to not only imagine, take the beauty that exists in a space and expose it to the public, but you're also showing something that's possible. What is, for you, the relationship between reality, depicting reality and bringing it out, and possibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's always the dance that you play. And in no way, I think, I'm extremely critical of graffiti. I celebrate it. I think I learn so much from it, but I'm also critical of some of the things I see. So I have to put that out there. I think being a product or being a student of that space, being a student of what graffiti at its best represents, like you said, it represents this type of ground-up communication. You know, in the public spaces is not void of communication. We see this very top-down communication, where if you have money to pay for a billboard, if you can do this, then you can communicate to the public and no one asks questions. And I think graffiti at its best exists as a way of saying people will always speak back to you, or people will always speak or show that they're present in those spaces. I think that question of hope in the midst of despair, or having hope in the midst of being truthful, is definitely something that all artists have to be conscious of. You have to be that mirror. You have to be like Nina Simone said, and be, how she said it, it's an artist's duty to reflect the times. So you have to be that mirror. But I think in the context of being a mirror, you also have to be a prisoner of hope. You have to understand that your ability as an artist is to paint what could be as well. And sometimes that's just a matter of collaborating with the voices of the people, because I think the hope has always been around us. You know, it's not like the artist has the weight of hope, but in most times it's for me just to listen to how an elder is interpreting hope and being able to translate that to a painting. But it's definitely a dance that occurs. You don't want to just paint all the wrong. Somehow you got to show that we all have a responsibility to envision what things could be.
One of your exhibits, your first exhibit in Studio B, perhaps, was called Ephemeral Eternal.
Yeah.
Another of the qualities, the characteristics of your art form is that it is very often intended to be mortal, to be impermanent. Mm-hmm. What do you think, what does impermanence give to your art?
I think impermanence gives a sense of urgency. I think it gives a sense of, when I was in high school, a friend of mine had this epiphany. He was like, I know why we paint. I went to this art high school in New Orleans, and he's like, I know why we paint. We want to be immortal. We want our work to live forever. And that discouraged me, because every time I approached the canvas, I asked that question, does this deserve to last forever? And painting in the public space gave me peace and gave me liberation, because I knew whatever I painted couldn't last forever. And so it gave that sense of security in a way. But I do think there is, I think that's more true to life, this idea that there are these ephemeral moments that happen, but somehow these moments are connected to an eternal thread. And so my painting doesn't have to last forever to connect to a thread that will. You know, this idea of love is definitely not ephemeral. You know, that's something that's going to last forever. And if I can allow a painting to spark a conversation that will connect to that internal thread, then I think that my job is done. It doesn't have to be on someone's wall forever and ever and ever and ever to do that. And I think that it gives us more urgency around the types of moments we celebrate. I mean, everything in here, in this space, the exhibit is all about moments of individuals that we celebrate. And I think it's easy for us to disconnect from that when we see it that way, when we see it as a painting on the wall. I think for me, the ephemeral nature is this challenge that says, this moment ended, and where do you begin with it? You know, how is this relay race, this baton being passed? Yeah. And I think that's the joy I have in painting these ephemeral things, because when someone sees it gone, it's like, okay, it's not gone because it's still in you, and how do we keep it moving? And that's true to history, I think. That's more true to life, this relay race of giants, relay race of responsibility, this relay race of just people who are charged with this mission to make the world a better place.
Right. Your work is filled with these dichotomies, reality and possibility, and one of them is between history and the future. So much of your work is in dialogue. It's referencing all of these, both visual references from history, but also you are depicting some of the people that actually made the communities that you're working in. Talk about how you learned some of the history of your place, and talk about how you're carrying that history forward into the future with programs like Toussaint.
Yeah, I think for me, so I went to high school visual arts, and then I decided I was done with visual arts. I didn't see myself reflected. Long story short, I was just like, what am I going to do with knowing how to paint? And so I went to college for filmmaking, figured I would do more work as a filmmaker and be more impactful. After college, I got a job at this space called New Orleans Public Access Television. It's like a public access TV station. I sat behind the camera, and there's two main lanes that people go there. It was either religious programming or elders from the community who had a lot to say, who just wanted to get on their soapbox. And so I found myself, you know, my job was really to be behind the camera, but I think my job was also sitting at the feet of these elders. And it was from there that I began to have this fascination and appreciation for history, for not the national aspect of history, that this person from all the way over there did something, but they were teaching me that this woman that lived right there, she did something, or this elder that went over there, he did something. And I immediately saw space differently. I didn't see it as what it could be. I was more fascinated as what it was, you know, that this was a sacred ground because someone over there just walked past 10 years ago and did something amazing. And if anyway, the connection has been that the art has been allowed to do the same thing, that I can amplify those stories on those same walls that talk about what happened in the past. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. I'm sorry. I'm like looking at this counter and I'm like, oh, I got to talk fast.
I think so. Part of the work that you do now is actually to enable, to the first image that we saw, is to enable kids to come in and engage with some of this history and make some images of their own. What is 2 Cent?
Yeah, I mean, there's an elder artist in New Orleans, no longer living, named John Scott, and he had this phrase called "pass it on," and I'm a big product of that. Like elders and people who took the time to pass it on to me. And I know that it's the moment that I have now. I don't know how long it will last, but the moment while people are paying attention, I'm conscious of being able to pass it on. And so 2 Cent, we have a summer program where we teach and engage youth, teenagers in the city to be able to be their own storytellers, whether it be through media or through art. And that's the whole goal. I mean, to continue to make sure that this doesn't end with us, that this doesn't end now, that this has a long continuum, that people are bold enough to sell their truth and to speak their story.
B. Mike, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.